Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, we're having our in-depth look into rifles, which has been a little bit of a time coming because there's been a little bit of a gap between rifles and the other ones, and mostly because I wanted to set up rifles a little bit differently and spend a little time to get the spreadsheet to a better level, which I feel I have now. And yeah, we're going to discuss them over a spreadsheet and go into them. In rifles, though, the burst and sustain numbers are less of an... they're more of a guideline, more than an, where they, with ARs, you can actually hit it. Even if you're trying to max out your burst CPS with a rifle, you'll likely still be behind it. It depends on you clicking, or maybe a macro clicking for you. But all of those are kind of lossy, so we'll discuss them in that context as well. But mostly we'll discuss which ones are worth picking, because even if you want to just get a little bit of damage out, there are obvious standouts in the category now, and we'll go over some of them. And of course, everything will be linked down below and timestamped, so you can jump around as you want. We're going to start off with the premise, where we'll go over the build. We're going to discuss them over and then go into burst and then into sustained DPS. And the spreadsheet we're going to base this all on lives in the burst and sustain tables with the rest of them. It is this 4.0 rifles on high-end glass red. As I went with the high-end glass red because I feel that is the most generic build we could kind of pick for it. If we're going to do ARs and such on strikers, I feel a high-end red is the way to go for rifles, and then glass will work for all of the talents, for instance, because of course there are some weapons also in this list where, for instance, focus can be our major focus for it. But I went with a high-end red. The results of it is here, as we have a burst list first and a sustain list second. This spreadsheet has also been altered, where the talent now is actually inside of the spreadsheet itself, as I was using for the other ones. Basically taking the stats as they were in the sheet, taking them over to a talent calculator, calculating out the increase of that talent, and then bringing that back. One of the reasons this took a little bit longer is that I've implemented this here now for this case for Boomerang, for Strength, and for Optimist into the spreadsheet. And I am actually going to bring that back to the AR, SMG, and LMG ones so that we can actually alter values into here. And you can do that as well for yourself. If you copy this to your own Google Drive, you can alter any of the values, for instance, to be your build, or for instance, as well, these gradings, as we do have a few conceits here. And let's go to those. As yeah, we are setting the build up in a specific way. And that is that everything is with grade 25. So with all of the weapons, we're adding in basically 25 weapon damage, which would come from the grade 25 weapon. We're choosing to go with 20% headshot rate and 60% DTA rate. These two numbers are just based on what I think is the regular experience. These two numbers will wildly differ on content, on the player, on what you're doing, which weapon you're running. We do have to pick something, and I'm picking 20% headshot rate, as I feel that is something that in most content, in just matchmaking heroics and such, you can reach quite decently. 60% DTA rate is, it's kind of averaging out solo and group play and stuff like that. Also very dependent on content, again, very dependent on the player as well, kind of how they play and such. For both, well, especially more for headshot, of course. Those are our conceits. We have to pick something. Those are the things that are picked. Here, though, with the build itself, we are doing two different types of builds, because there are one set of weapons that are 15 crit chance or more. Actually, there are none that are more, which is basically the 3 mod weapons, where we put 3 crit chance mods on them. For instance, on this ACRSS, we have the 3 crit chance mods, and then we have the magazine mod. The magazine as well, we can choose to, for instance, with these larger mags, to not extend them further. So a common thing you could pick here is a plus 20 round mag, this plus 20 minus 10 reload. You could pick these, taking them to, for instance, with in the case of the ACR SS here, from 30 to 50 rounds. But what you can do as well is take a stability mag. And that is also one of the things that we actually do have in that spreadsheet. And that is that with some of them, you will see they have the, in square brackets, they have BM. That means that they have a big mag. And in the case, for instance, here in burst, that of course doesn't matter for burst. The mag size does not enter into the burst DPS. But of course, later on with sustain, it really does matter. So here, all of the big mag weapons are basically, if it's a flat line, for instance, here for the ACRSS, the right next door to it is the big mag one. I've kept it still like this though, just, you know, I haven't taken them out because that saves me some time. But then, of course, in the sustain, those will matter, as all of the big mag weapons, as you can already see, are kind of at the top. But yeah, you can of course forego the big mag to, for instance, in these rifles to gain some stability. But then for some weapons, you definitely don't want to. For instance, the M1A or the M1A CQB. So for instance, for those, we've only gone with big mag. And then for weapons that have either less mod slots or are, for instance, with flatline, where you have to, in general, give up one of the slots for this link laser pointer, you can, of course, play it with pulse or with a spotting drone or something. But in general, that doesn't work out, I feel. A link laser pointer is a very consistent way to get flatline going. Because of that, they're losing 5 crit chance. For any time we have that, also, for instance, with the classic M1A, as one of the big examples, if there is a less than 15 crit chance on the weapon, we're actually swapping the Grupo mask over to a Coyote mask. So because of that, we're landing, basically, we're serving up that Coyote to fill up this 54 crit chance we have here to 60. And this 185 goes to 195 as we're picking the mid-range buff for the Coyote. That is a conceit we just have to make, basically, because this is better for 2 mods or less weapons that have 10 crit chance or less on the weapon. That also includes, for instance, the exotics, which have even less sometimes. And with those as well, we have altered the mods or stats on the gear to basically reach their best potential, which they can reach by flipping a crit damage mod on points to crit chance, basically stat wise. So yeah, that is our premise. So we have basically 2 builds, 2 versions of the build. And the version with the Grupo as well, just to point that out, that ends up on instead of the, if we go back to a 3 mod weapon, that lands on this 59 and 200, which is actually kind of an awkward number. And that's also because we're kind of considering it to be solo. If we're going to put in, group numbers, it's going to kind of obfuscate things a little bit. So we're just considering it in a solo setting. That is our conceits. Let's go and see actually what our results then are. And yeah, to start it off, let's just start with the top of the spreadsheet. As what we have here is all of the weapons in a row. I have left out some weapons. For instance, the SOCOM M1A. The SOCOM M1A is just a worse M1A CQB. They should have the same stats in TU10. They basically forgot to buff the SOCOM M1A. And they haven't fixed that in Project Resolve, which I was expecting them to maybe do, but yeah. So we're, for instance, leaving out that one. With a lot of the weapons, I'm actually choosing to not put all of their talents in there, or to have every weapon with every talent, also with Big Mag or Small Mag. We're making a smaller selection of some of the weapons to be kind of representative of the rest. And we're especially picking the M1A CQB, the classic M1A, the UCS, which is the top burster, and we're picking it because of that. We're picking the ACR SS as it is the second one, but also the one I feel that is kind of like usable in the same way that an AK would be kind of like the UCS. The FAMAS or the F2000 will be much more like the ACR SS. For the other weapons, we are keeping them in with, for instance, the LVOC and the lightweight M4 and the MDR and such, with a boomerang, with Big Mag and Small Mag, or well, with, for instance, a stability mag or some such. Just as a comparison point, and then that of course will matter a little bit more, as yeah, they're all side by side here in burst, but it will matter a little bit more once we reach sustain. All of the exotics are in here, as for instance the Vindicator with its talents being active, and also for instance Diamondback with its talent active, and then for instance with them inactive down here. They aren't very, outside of the Vindicator, they aren't very indicative of the exotics, because of course, for instance, the Diamondback kind of needs its own build. The Merciless and the Ravenous do special things, which are hard to quantify. You can't really burst or sustain DPS them without taking up an entire chart like this, because for the Ravenous, you would kind of have to have, like, you know, 2 of the left shoulder, 4 of the left shoulder, 6 of the left shoulder, and that could fill up this whole thing. And it wouldn't really enlighten us much, because we don't use the Ravenous in the same way that we use the other rifles, which is just to, you know, use them just for the damage. We do special things with the Ravenous in special places, basically. Same kind of with the Merciless. It kind of depends on how many enemies are around it. This is just its burst DPS, and then on top of this, of course, the talent kind of matters. We might in the future have a little bit more of an in-depth look into them specifically, and kind of how we can try to maybe quantify them in some form, but I didn't want to clutter up this list excessively, so I didn't. Same, for instance, as well, again, why some of the talents aren't on all weapons. Actually, one of the other ones that we have picked as having most of the talents is actually the Mark 17. And yeah, let's actually go to the top, and yeah, if we actually compare this, for instance, with the burst and sustain tables as they already exist for rifles, it is kind of the same order, and that's mostly because most of the weapons in this class are 3-mod. It isn't like with the ARs, where there are 2 top weapons, one with 3 mods, crit chance mods, one with 2 crit chance mods that you kind of have to compare on build. Most of these weapons have actually 3 crit chance mods available to them and then a magazine slot. So yeah, we see M1A CQB here with Flatline with the Big Mag. For the M1As, I have actually always kept them with the Big Mag. The smaller mag numbers, giving up 5 rounds, basically just ends up killing them completely, to me at least. So we're just not even considering them, we're just taking Big Mag numbers. In this case, Flatline, of course, winning out, Strained and Optimist following that up a little bit. I do have to say about Strained, while we do have Strained in here, I would mostly pick it for the faster firing rifles. You have a half of a second to have 2 shots go out. Basically, you have a maximum of a half a second between 2 shots that you have to take. And that is a lot more inconsistent, especially, for instance, for something like a classic M1A. While you can actually take 3 shots per second with a classic M1A, that does mean that if you're, for instance, going from one target to another target, you will likely lose Strained. This is the reason we're picking Boomerang as the main talent here. I can tell you already as well, and we have that here as well, although I'll have to zoom out and we'll have to scroll all the way to the right, where there's the implementation of the damage talents on the right side, all the way there. If you want to go have a look for yourself, it does actually state what the actual increase is versus for the talent, basically. It is very small here, but for most of the Boomerang ones, it is 3.9% or 3.7%. It kind of depends on the weapon damage. And so, of course, because the weapon damage is actually where Boomerang fits in, it is giving you 40 weapon damage on the shots that you're taking with Boomerang active. This is a build, of course, at 25 grading, so we are actually basically giving the worst case scenario for Boomerang, and it shows. But the thing is with Boomerang, even though it is basically just under 4% for most of these builds as an increase, that is still okay because it's a very consistent 4%. While, for instance, Strained on some of these weapons is anywhere between like 8 and 10%, that isn't something that you can consistently do, especially with strained. Making that actually optimist, to me, becomes a much cleaner choice, even though that lands basically between 5 and 7%. I believe the highest one is 7%, where we, or 6%, where we reach at. So it is a smaller increase, but much more consistent, and consistency matters. That's why also, yeah, I'm picking Boomerang as kind of like the general talent that is going to be on a lot of these weapons. And then we're adding in Optimist and Strained for a few of the special cases, just to not make this list a billion years long. And yeah, the M1A CQB kind of is the top one, but the M1A CQB, of course, as well has only 15 rounds. That gets a little bit better with, in the case of Boomerang, because Boomerang does also act as well for increasing the mag size. Those rounds that return to the magazine, they will basically be an extra round that you're firing inside of that magazine. And we see here that, for instance, for the 15 round Classic M1A, it goes to a 19 round. That is actually a tangible increase as well. And of course, you're not going to see those returns on burst, but yeah, you will see those returns on sustain, as we'll see a little bit later on. So there is definitely, I would say, a choice here to be made. Flatline, always for rifles, has been a really good talent since its addition in Season 9. Before that, Boomerang was always the pick, and for good reason, even though Strained and Optimist were always, and still are, competitive to it, especially with the now, for instance, as we'll go into the Mark 17, I would, for instance, there consider Strained or Optimist as well, because of this larger mag size. Well, especially Strained, for instance. But yeah, the consistency of reaching the end of the mag, for instance, for Optimist, is also debatable often, as yeah, you do have a lot of damage per mag. So the talent choices here is very, yeah, there's no like, it isn't as with ARs where I go like, okay, go Strained with this weapon, with this build, or Fast Hands, or like Preservation, or Future Perfect if you're looking for some utility. It's a lot more wishy-washy, even more so for rifles, where you do have a selection of talents that kind of work out well. And Boomerang, even though it is percentually not that big of an increase in burst, it is still one of the big contenders. Also because it adds to sustain, also because it has that utility for the max size, which adds to sustain, and because it is consistent. As long as you're basically firing, you're kind of hitting the averages of Boomerang, as long as you're firing a decent amount of shots. Let's talk about the Vindicator. Now, the Vindicator, of course, quite recently, yesterday of filming of this, received its changes that it will now work with focus. It is up here. It is pretty high up here when the talent is active. And this is active on the chest. I've actually left out active on the legs, which has actually a 15% decrease actually from this. But if we then try to go and find the inactive one, we have to scroll down pretty far. It is pretty far down the list, and it is a big jump. It is a 40% amp. That is, yeah, that puts it basically at the bottom when you're not hitting the thing, and at the top when you are hitting the thing for this build. But what it is to me very much is, if you're going focus already, if you're, for instance, going negotiator focus, I could definitely see this as a pick. I would pair it with a secondary weapon that to have alongside of it, where, for instance, because of course warhounds and mini tanks and turrets and all of those kinds of things don't get marked. If you're shooting the tanks at the end of Roosevelt, for instance, those don't get marked. If you're shooting the APC in Wall Street, those don't get marked. You need a different tool for those moments, but for all of the the majority of things you'll be shooting at, which are just the squishy people running around, it does work. So yeah, you kind of have to play it smart like that and pair it with something else to deal with the rest, and then use this on the moments where it's active. And if you use it mostly when it is active, mostly hitting the targets that are marked for you, this does seem decent. But, and as you may have gathered there from how I was going with that sentence, there is a big but, and that big but is that it jumps up quite a lot. The MDR is not a precision rifle. It is actually one of the worst jump aroundies. The stability of it is quite bad, especially in comparison to the LVOC, even the lightweight M4, and to me, especially the ACRSS. It is not as consistent as the rest. It doesn't have good mods for it as well, as for instance, with high ends, you can, of course, go with a stability mod. Hell, you could even go with a second stability mod on the muzzle and go with the Coyote at that point, giving up even a little bit more damage, but trying to get consistency out of it. You can't really do that with the Vindicator, and that is actually quite hurting it quite bad, I feel. It is a decent choice if you're going focus. That is basically my recommendation there. We have one other standout here as well, which is the Dr. Home, and that's mostly because it's based off of the lefty, or the stage left, I should say, in-game, which is the SOCOM M1A, but then the stage left has, for some reason, has 30 RPM more. So does the Dr. Home, and that actually puts it quite up high here, making it also a decent choice if you're going focus, just for its damage. Because, yeah, it doesn't have an active talent, and this kind of actually as well kind of pushes the Vindicator away from that slot, I feel. And basically, kind of in the same vein as with the Ouroboros, you're basically, even if you forgo the talent, it is a decent pick. But again, it is one where you're putting yourself into a scope. That actually is, to me, actually the bigger killer for both of these weapons. Being in a scope can be very dangerous. It can be pretty okay if you are doing, for instance, a legendary where you know where everything's going to spawn, but in the open world, in Summit, in Countdown and such, it is just not a thing that you can consistently do. Let's move on to some of the other ones where we have here the Artist tool, and this is with Rifleman always active, which of course, and at max stacks, which of course it can't. This one is more in here, so you can kind of compare how high that talent can get, and it is a very powerful talent, Rifleman. We haven't put it in for the other weapons, and the reason for that as well, and this is the reason this one is the only one in here, is it has stacking mechanics, so we would have to add in, at 1 stacks, at 2 stacks, at 3 stacks for each of the weapons and such, or each of the weapons we would want to add this on. That isn't a great... Yeah, that would be annoying for the spreadsheet, but it is a good talent and one you should consider, especially if you're hitting heads quite often. Then we get to what I would consider one of while the M1A CQB is the Burst King here, the UCS is also quite high up there. It is, of course, not even really reaching the same numbers, but it is especially usable in a much more consistent sense just because of its mag size. This 15-round mag, as we'll see, especially in the sustain in a second, the UCS basically lands decently good on bursts and sustain both, where the M1A CQB definitely does not. Making it actually, for me, the overall, it's kind of like the FAMAS of this category. Then we have actually what I would consider the F2000 of this category then, which is the ACRSS, which is the other high top pick. And while it is a little bit less than the UCS, it is a lot more consistent in its damage. It also has a 30-round mag instead of a 20-round mag, making it much more... it's a much easier choice to go without the plus 20 mag, because then you have 30 rounds still. You can have the 20 stability on a mag, where here it is a little bit awkward taking it to 20 rounds, although still a decent choice, and one that we, for instance, do make for Optimus for it. So with most of these weapons, the strained one, I've actually kept the big mag, because that makes sense, because strained cares about the mag size. Optimus doesn't. Optimus only cares about the weapon damage. So the Optimus ones are mostly without the big mag, and that's actually what I would do as well, or recommend. If you're going with the big mag, you can go strained, and actually if you're continuously firing, and especially for some cases where, yeah, you are consistently firing for a longer time, a big mag with strained can actually be a really good choice. For consistency's sake, Optimist can also be a really good choice, but even more consistent than that is Boomerang. And yeah, we do see kind of the order of it, as we'll repeat this order basically over and over again, which is that first flatline, then strained, then optimist, then boomerang, in that order for the burst DPSs here. And yeah, the ACRSS, a really good pick, but you have to click 7 times a second. This is same actually for the UCS. This is something that a lot of people aren't willing to do. As I hear over and over again that, yeah, it's too much clicking, and I can agree with that. I can make a UCS work for like 20 minutes, and then I'll swap to whatever my secondary is, basically, because after a while, repetitive strain injury is a thing, and yeah, you should try to avoid it. But you can, of course, macro this, for instance. Is that legal? I'm not the Senate, I don't care. You can. Plenty of people have. They haven't cracked down on it. Most games kind of allow it, as long as you don't overdo it. Should you? Here is the thing. With rifles, even with these higher ones, with this burst DPS, we're in the 10 to 11 million range. If you compare this to even Striker with AR, they will quite consistently beat this at around 60 to 70 stacks for most of these weapons, for their top-end weapons. And that's kind of the thing that rifles kind of lack. Well, the Alpha Strike, and Alpha Strike in a lot of games is, a thing that is valued, and in Division as well. A classic M1A hitting really hard per shot can be actually a pretty good deal. It just does not compare to strikers with an AR or SMG or LMG. And that's kind of the thing that rifles kind of lack, is they don't have a gear set for them, or high-ends aren't competitive enough. So yeah, you kind of have to always keep that in mind. But just for playing something different, because I do run rifles, I myself also run rifles, just for something different, just to, try to get the most out of some other builds sometimes, it can be quite of good value. And of course, they don't have, if you set them up, for instance, with flatline, you are not dealing with the stacking mechanic, and that at points does have value. For instance, the floor 100 hunters, something like that. It is sometimes better to have the damage up front, or raids actually quite consistently. Although I wouldn't take rifles into raids. Again, I would just take ARs at that point. But yeah, after that tangent, let's go down this list a little bit more, and we'll reach to one of the other standouts, which I would definitely recommend, as it is quite high up in this list. And we are dropping from those 7 clicks a second for the ACR-SS and the UCS. We're dropping down to 275 RPM, which is just below 5 clicks a second. For reference, the classic M1A is 180 RPM, meaning that it is 3 clicks a second. This 275 is just below 5. That is actually very achievable and very consistent. And also because you're clicking 5 times a second, you need to recoil compensate less times per second. Because if you're clicking 7 times a second, you need to recoil compensate 7 times a second, recoil the target 7 times per second, and then fire again. So doing it less times per second is of great value. You are giving up damage for it, of course, but I feel the Mark 17s are the standout weapons now. They are so much higher than the classic M1As that we have all the way down here, that I would definitely recommend, if you like rifles, to, this is basically the general use rifle for me now. And I've already added it to many builds, and yeah, it feels pretty good. Especially the Soko Mark 17 is generally the better one. The Mark 17 without any additions to it is the lesser one. But both of them work perfectly fine, and this 5 clicks a second is actually quite a difference, or even less than. Damage-wise, they put out more than enough. They also have long rails. Basically, most of these weapons do have long rails available, so you can go flatline with them. And that's maybe still what I would do with them as well. Go flatline, go with Spotter, because of course Obliterate kind of has... it takes too long to stack up to full. Even though with its increase to 10 seconds duration of it remaining, It's still, I would pick flatline plus spotter as a general use for rifles, as that works pretty well, as you have a lot of upfront damage. But also, of course, you can go glass plus flatline, for instance, or glass plus some of the other talents if you want to not be technician. Then we have the Diamondback, and the Diamondback, of course, has its talent where it provides its own crit chance. And that means that actually the Diamondback needs its own build. This build is really not conducive to it. We've still added it into here, but I'm also not going to make a specific build for it because you could forgo all of the crit chance on the build, just having, for instance, crit damage and headshot. You could have negotiators, for instance, and just having headshot or a crit damage on it, and then a headshot alongside of it for the high-end pieces and such. If you make a specific build for it, the Diamondback can be much higher than this, but in this specific case where we're on a build that isn't set up for it, it is kind of middle of the road, and yeah, you'll have that as well. It isn't still even a great weapon, even if you go for a build for it, but we might actually revisit some of the rifles, as I talked about the Merciless and Ravenous as well. We might revisit them on specific builds for them and kind of try to suss out like where they actually fit in if you try to pull out the most of them in their specific situations where they work. And yeah, we see the kind of the repeating pattern of the talents coming in through here again. One thing of note is that, for instance, here I have strained for the ACR-SS. That's the only place where we've put it with the Big Mag and without. And yeah, it is a decent loss to go without the Big Mag, especially for strained. So, for instance, with the Boomerang, of course, Boomerang doesn't care about the mag size per se, not for burst, but strained does because it's reliant on the mag size. The larger the mag size, the more you're at the max stacks of it. And yeah, the Big Mag variant is much higher than the strained variant, although, well, I mean, it is a decent-ish amount. So especially for strained, if you want to go strained, I would recommend the Big Mag. Although with the 30-round ones, you can still get away with it because, for instance, yeah, this ACR-SS is still above some of the others. Then we see basically the order as it is also for the burst and sustain tables, which is that, yeah, it goes into LVOEC, it goes into lightweight M4, MDR. Here we do see actually the classic M1A with flatline being a decently high up here. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we start going into some of the lower Mark 17s. We see some of the SIGs popping up. The SIGs are, I would definitely say the LVOC, the lightweight M4, MDR, and all the SIGs are kind of usable, but they're just mid-tiers. I would definitely pick the Mark 17s over them. You have to even click less, and their accuracy and stability is actually preferable, I feel, to most of these, especially because you have to click less. So these are kind of, yeah, they don't really have anything specifically going for them. So for instance, even in the AR category, we have the G36 ACRE, which have long rails, which the other weapons, the top weapons don't, so you can make a choice for them. Personally, I wouldn't really invest into these for general picks. I'd go with the Mark 17 or with the ACR-SS or with the USC. That's also why we've given those most of the talents comparisons. And then, yeah, we go into the M16, the 3-round burster here. It can be actually kind of handy to use it because, yeah, you get 3 shots every time you click. So you actually don't have to click as much. But it is because you're not in control of of the burst, especially with all the other rifles, you know exactly when you're clicking. So you're recall compensating the second that you're clicking. You can get used to it with the M16A2. It takes a while though, because the second and third burst shots aren't controlled by you per se. You kind of need to get that rhythm down to do the recall compensation at the right time, because if you don't, of course, it goes way off target. And that's kind of the downside of the M16s. And also, yeah, we still see that they're way down here. I'd pick a Mark 17 again over these if you want to click less. We have the inactive Vindicator, the Resolutes, and then actually the classic M1As start to pop up. And especially the thing is that classic M1As, of course, do gain a decent amount from Optimus, but actually their strain isn't as great. It does, of course, it is still higher, even if you go strained with it. But you basically have 3 rounds a second that is your firing rate, and you need to put out 2 rounds per second at the minimum for it to keep strained up. And that is kind of the thing with the slower firing rifle like a classic M1A, where you can't actually consistently do that. And I feel that's kind of, you have to consider strained as much less uptime than, for instance, Optimus or especially Boomerang. So I would actually still, general pick Boomerang. I've always agreed with, especially for these also smaller max size rifles, because it increases them as well, of course, or increases the max size by a decent amount, basically, effectively. And that can be very valuable, especially when you have only 15 rounds, taking that to this 19 or 20 for the M1A CQBs and such. We also have the baker's dozen in here, just as a comparison. And this is the reason, for instance, why we usually say go a Boomerang Classic M1A over a baker's dozen. You basically get a decent amount more damage out of it. Now, the difference between these two isn't that much. It's just 2%. They're just above each other, but that is still a 2% damage loss, basically. And with the Boomerang one, also, you're much more likely to actually get, the higher hits in, which can actually, if you can kill an enemy, one of the things is that Alpha Strike really provides is that the time to kill of an enemy goes down because you're killing them earlier than if you were fragmenting that same damage over longer times, which, for instance, if your enemy has 50 million health, you're hitting them in one shot for 50 million health, they're instantly dead, basically. If you're hitting them for 51 millions in over, with much higher burst, for instance, because the reload of that 50 million is much higher, theoretically, you could benefit from the Alpha Strike, and that's something that will happen quite often with, for instance, a hard hitter like a Classic M1A. You might actually one-tap a red, for instance, and get them out of play right away. There is definitely some value to that. Then we have the Merciless, and the Merciless, as we discussed earlier, basically needs its own thing. On damage alone, it is definitely not competitive. It never was. There is some value to it basically being a 200 RPM weapon because you can click down and then click up. You kind of have to get that rhythm down for it, which is very annoying and takes quite a while. And then there's the explosion. There is no real good way to quantify the explosion in a spreadsheet form. There might be one enemy around it, there might be none, there might be 24. You can't really quantify it, except you could, well, it could be its own whole spreadsheet, basically. We're just leaving it the story here, but what I can tell is, just from experience, it's just not worth it. It ends up that just with, for instance, something like the Regulus, that explosion isn't as consistent as you would want it, but with the Regulus, at least you have something like Headhunter, where you can make it consistent. Because if you could make this, happen consistently when you needed it to, at the moment that a wave spawns or something, it could be great, like with the Regulus. This isn't that. Also, we have the Perfect Boomerang with Virginian. Virginian is, and the 1886s, as they are all the way down here. And we only really have 1886 with Boomerang here, just as comparison to the Virginian, just so we see that the Virginian is better at Boomerang than just normal Boomerang, which, you could have guessed already. The 1886s have a different role, basically. They are mostly used more for Headhunter, sometimes with Determined. And they have the highest base damage shot, as they have quite high base damages, basically double any other rifle. That is their value. The talents, we use them for that, basically for Headhunter, and their bursts and sustains are not comparable, but they don't need to be. They have their own niche, basically. But then we have actually one weapon that I see sometimes be recommended, and I definitely would not, is the UIC. And actually, I was considering cutting it from this list just because it's way too low. And it is way too low. But I just wanted to have it in here just to show this, where it is at the end of the burst line by a mile. We, of course, have two exotics underneath it, the inactive Diamondback, which is understandable, and we have the Ravenous there. We'll discuss that in a second, but yeah, the UIC is just way too low on the burst. It also, while decent on the sustain, isn't actually that great on the sustain either, as we'll go into that in a second. To me, I don't really understand what the role of this weapon is. It is very accurate, it is very stable, it is a very low rate of fire, but at the cost of this amount of damage, together with that, you know, ARs exist. At that point, just go with an AR, right? Here we have the Diamondback inactive, of course, on a build. Also, again, not made for it. Then we have the Ravenous, but the Ravenous, of course, again, as well. Kind of with the Merciless, we're kind of short-changing it here because we're putting it in only as its main hits, which is, of course, not what you use it for. You use its talent. Quantifying its talent could take two of these whole spreadsheets, basically. So we're kind of leaving it out here. We'll revisit it, but the Ravenous has always been good. It is now better. Yeah, well worth using for its, especially for its armor hits, and of course, you know, just swapping the shoulders over, and of course, it can do things that no other weapon can, which is like preparing things like Razorback for a one shot and such. That is all of the bursts. Let's go have a talk about the sustains next. And to continue on with the sustain, indeed. I'll be a lot shorter here because, yeah, we discussed a lot of things in the burst ones. We'll start off here by saying that the 100% point, I put it a little bit lower than the rest, same as with the AR videos and such. We put it with the ACR with the flatline here, with the Big Mac, as 100% point for sustain. As some of these other weapons are kind of like more theoretical, especially, of course, the Rifleman's and the Vindicator always being active. So that we just have that 100% here and not at the top here, even though they're not like that different, actually, in this case. Let's start off with the Vindicator. So yeah, with the Vindicator active again, it is actually at the top now of sustain. It has a decently sized magazine, of course, and that helps it with this super fast reload, super low reload. It actually lands up really high on the sustain for when the talent is active. If we go looking for when it's inactive, it is again, it is towards the bottom and kind of again as it was with the burst. I feel the Vindicator is definitely usable. Damage-wise, it just ends up a little less usable, especially it being as jumpy as it is at the 380 RPM that it has. Because yeah, this is all, again, 6 clicks a second. I would generally pick an ACR SS, for instance, over it. And again, with the mods where you can, for instance, add a bunch of stability to an ACR SS, especially if you give up the Big Mag and go a little bit lower. Yeah, the Vindicator is okay, especially if you're going focus, but because it is still pretty high up here when it is active, but yeah, you're not always, of course, going to hit the target where it is marked, just because you can't. Their body might be behind cover, their head might be behind a wall, so, and you can only hit their toe, stuff like that. And I would have definitely, it is worth running, but I would pair it with a different weapon alongside of it as well. Then yeah, we see the artist tools again at full stacks, considering them basically as full stacks. You do gain a lot from Rifleman, but actually what we see is, yeah, not enough, I would say. I would personally pick Flatline over Rifleman generally. I might even go with Strained over it as well. Rifleman is decent, but you have to hit those headshots, and again, not everything has a head. Depending on content, if you're fighting Black Dusk, I would be less inclined to use this, for instance, than if I was just fighting Outcast or such. Then we see what I would say is the general picks is, for instance, yeah, the ACRSS, the Mark 17s. I would say those, to me, are the two top picks. ACRSS, of course, again, 7 clicks a second. It's kind of hard. It does require some practice. I definitely am kind of accustomed to the ACRSS. kind of enjoy it, actually. But also, I don't enjoy it for hours and hours. Usually 20 minutes of the ACRSS is enough for me. The Mark 17, I can see myself using a bit longer. But again, numbers-wise, on burst and sustain, it just... Rifles really need a gear set. We see the same actually here again of the order of things, which is that flatlines come first, then strained. In this case, though, then boomerang, as we're looking for. Actually, that's because in a second, the optimists, of course, are only with the small mags because that's where they matter more. So we've only kept them with that. But yeah, this flatline, of course, a really good pick for rifles. It works well with them, and strained less so, I would say, than this. And boomerang is still effectively here, especially on the sustain. It catches up to to strained quite a lot on the sustain. This is the reason why I would say general picking boomerang or strained is basically equivalent, because if you only look at it as the burst, yeah, strained is a lot ahead. But boomerang, of course, also adds to the magazine size of weapons. So when you have, for instance, the ACRSS here with boomerang, and here with on top with strained with the big mag, the boomerang actually adds in 15 rounds basically extra with the big mag there, and yeah, it starts catching up, and it is consistent. Strained generally ends up not as consistent, and that's kind of the issue for it, especially on rifles. In comparison to boomerang, which is basically just if you fire enough, you'll hit the average of boomerang. Mark 17s again, and then yeah, we have again the LVOC, lightweight M4, MDR, Resolute, the SIGs. Again, basically the burst and sustain tables mirrored here, and that's again because they have the same amount of mods. Their base damages are basically different, so yeah, they're gonna land up kind of in the same order. What we do have, though, is all of the Big Mag weapons, of course, are way above all of the non-Big Mag weapons. But, of course, that does come at the cost of the opportunity cost of having, for instance, a stability mag in an ACRSS, which is actually the thing that I do. So usually what I do is for Boomerang ACRSS, I would pick it without the larger mag size, because, yeah, with the larger mag size, you also kind of have to, put out 50 rounds for it to be worth it. If you are reloading every 10 rounds, which I end up doing basically, you're much better off without that bigger mag size. Boomerang will still be consistent there, but actually if we look at the ACRSS with Boomerang, it is actually above the ACRSS with strained, both without the big mag. Here Boomerangs, just adding into the mag size as well, actually elevates it on sustain over strained. So this is kind of the reason we picked Boomerang, because while its upper bound is a little bit lower, its lower bound is a little bit higher. So it is a much more consistent band that it's in over strained, and also as a talent, it is much more consistent just to trigger it. But then again, to me, the standouts here especially are the ACRSS as one of the top ones. The UCS, of course, is actually always kind of up there as well. Although, especially without the Big Mag, it kind of falls away. This is kind of the reason why I generally pick the ACRSS over the UCS if you're going for a really fast-firing rifle, because both of them have the 420 as their RPM. The ACRSS makes up quite a bit in sustain, especially. Yeah, the Mark 17. And the Mark 17 is generally as well, it's kind of at the higher end of the pack, both with, as if we go up to this a little bit higher, it was all the way up here, just underneath the ACRSS on the sustain end, because of course it sustains decently well because its RPM is a lot lower. For decent mag size. Without the large mag even, it is still competitive as well, because it does have a 20 round mag, of course, instead of a 30 round, which, for instance, the ACRSS and the LVOC and the lightweight M4 have. And it is always basically present. It is always kind of in the pack, kind of showing its face. And that is a good enough reason to pick it, especially because, yeah, it is one of the slower firing rifles. Because, for instance, comparing that to the Resolute, which is a 300 RPM weapon, Yeah, it just does not compete. And then, for instance, with the UIC, which is an even slower firing weapon than the Mark 17, this 240, this is a big mag weapon, all the way down here on sustain, versus where the others, like the last big mag, the last other big mag ended here, the 6762 with the big mag with boomerang. This was the last one up here, and then there's a gap all the way to the UIC. The UIC needs a much bigger buff than it has at the, or well, much better stats than it has at the moment. Its accuracy and its stability just don't make up for it. I would rather take an ACR SS with all accuracy and stability mods and kind of outcompete that UIC on those kind of stats, because also it isn't that much more accurate than other weapons in this class, and still outcompete it, because yeah, it is way down there, as we saw earlier, on burst, and here again on sustain. Then if we move on, we'll have actually the M1A CQBs starting to show up. And the M1A CQBs, this boomerang one with Big Mag is kind of up here, but yeah, as we see, all of the other ones, Optimist, Strained, even Flat Line is all the way, for instance, here. All of them are very low. This is the trap that the M1A CQB kind of presents. It is really good on burst. It is pretty bad on sustain. And that means that generally even 1 or 2 reloads in of this weapon, of the M1A CQBs, which is actually a pretty common occurrence with its 15 rounds, it will get caught up by other weapons. Especially as well, having a really long reload with a little smaller mag, it kind of, I can totally see it being used, and I often have used M1A CQBs. I wouldn't per se consider them that well anymore. I would rather have a Mark 17, which is going to consistently perform at a decent enough burst and a much better sustain. Still a decent pick though. It is definitely, if we're gonna basically go into what are the top weapons in this category, the M1A CQB to me, the ACR SS, the Mark 17, and still actually as well the M1A classic, the classic M1A. But for other reasons. We'll get to it in a second as well. Here we have the Ravenous, a lot higher on its sustain than on its burst, just for its hits. But of course, this is not the full story of it. And yeah, it has a lot of other abilities that we're not considering here. It is just in here just to kind of see what its base damage outputs are. Then we have the Dr. Home. Dr. Home kind of, again, why I would actually, for instance, kind of, if you're going focus, I'd likely pick a high-end or a Vindicator over the Dr. Home, because the Dr. Home, while it is really good on its burst, as we saw earlier, it's kind of having that issue of the M1A CQB, where it is much lower on its sustain and much lower on its sustain. Its lower bounds in its sustain DPS being so much lower does hurt it quite a lot. And again, a decently long reload, although not as long as, for instance, with the M1A CQB, you quite often die in there. There's a reason I prefer fast hands, for instance, on a lot of weapons. This is one of those where, like, I wouldn't put fast hands on a M1A CQB, to be clear, but one of the reasons I like fast hands is that you cut down the moments that you're not shooting because you don't have agency in those moments. This long reload gets me killed quite often. And yeah, of course, it is with a scope. So it is still very much usable, especially because its burst is so high. But yeah, be cognizant of how low its sustain is. Then we have the Inactive Vindicator, as we already kind of talked about it. We do have the UIC or the USC here as well, the 45. And this is kind of the reason why I picked the ACR SS over the USC. They both have to share the same RPM. The USC is also a lot more jumpy than it in use. I feel the stability, especially of the ACRSS, can be much better than the USC. And it being a 20-round mag, that goes to 40 with the big mag instead of a 30 round mag on the ACRSS, I generally pick myself the ACRSS over this. Then we do have the classic M1A, and the classic M1A, even though it is pretty low on burst and sustain here, it of course has a really high alpha strike basically. There is value to that, and also you just have to click less. That will never change the perception in this category, where just clicking 3 times a second is achievable definitely by everyone, where 5, you still kind of, you know, you have to kind of get into the rhythm of it. And yeah, the classic M1A, of course, did not get nerfed. There was no changes downward at all to anything. This is still doing what it was always doing, and still perfectly usable, just because it is basically the comfort weapon in the rifles. There is no other weapon that is this slow firing, basically, that you can consistently use, because well, you do have, of course, the 1886s, but yeah, they're also kind of a different beast than this. And yeah, again, we see kind of the order of the talents as they were. Definitely always use the big mag, of course, and yeah, it is a decent enough pick. And we also kind of see that actually on sustain, just because it has such a low fire rate, is actually kind of intermingled with the M1A CQB. That's how low the M1A CQB sustain is. Then we have the Mercilesses and the Diamondbacks, of course, where this build wasn't made for it. They're landing up very low. Same for the 1886. They're not really there for the burst and the sustain. They don't sustain at all. Really, that reload is atrocious for the you know, just 5 rounds that you have. It's here 7 with boomerang. But yeah, that is not the numbers that you want to see for sustain. But we use them for different purposes, basically. So yeah, we've kind of reached the end of this. Let's go actually, as I did with the ARs and SMGs and LMGs, let's go to a stash, and I'll go weapon by weapon, and we'll basically give our final thoughts on it. And as with the other in-depth look videos, we'll go one by one through the weapons, and I'll basically give my final thoughts on it. The Diamondback, if you make a build for it, it can be very powerful, as several people have shown through the years with the shenanigans that you can do with it, especially, for instance, with Negotiator, although most of them have been patched out, I feel, at this point. But yeah, it's very powerful if you do the right thing with it. Now having DTOC as well has been a great improvement to it. Dr. Home can be actually a general use rifle. That scope is kind of annoying. It's working with focus, at least, you know, going focus with it as well. Makes it one of the 2 big choices, or of the exotics for focus, I feel. It is very powerful, and its talent is actually pretty powerful on itself as well. Especially if multiple people are running it, you can actually get a decent amount of heals out of this. Ruthless and Merciless, these 2 being the same exact weapon. Merciless issue isn't per se actually in its DPS or such, or in its talent. It is much more in its stability. It is a weapon that isn't generally usable just because it jumps around way too much. Getting used to this mechanic can also, where the click in is a shot and the release of the click is the second shot, takes a while to get used to, so you have that as well. All of these things kind of work against this weapon. I feel if they actually especially added in a little bit of weapon handling, for instance, or just pure stability, or just reworked how much it jumped as a mechanic, it could be decent, because this explosion isn't horrendous if you kind of generally think of it as maybe some enemies might be around, but also there's quite often times where singular enemies are just spread out, and yeah, it just doesn't add up well. The Ravenous, of course, is a really powerful weapon. It can do things that no other weapon can, especially regarding its talent, of course. This amplified damage to armor plates is core to a lot of ways of breaking the game. So it definitely has its spots. As a general use weapon, I definitely don't use it generally. There are much better picks to me, I feel. For specific moments, it's unbeatable. So it always will have its spot. The newest addition in the Vindicator with its talent is a pretty decent weapon, actually. If you use it, you just need to kind of pair it together with a secondary that you can use as well. Especially pairing this with Focus, same for with Dr. Home, can be a pretty good deal, actually, because you're already, if you're going to use this weapon, you're already in the scope, you might as well have Focus alongside of it. This amp is pretty strong and will put it pretty high on the burst and sustain tables, but it quite lacks a little bit of, well, it does have accuracy and stability mods, it doesn't have enough for it to compensate against some of the other choices we can make. Let's go to the high ends. We'll start off with the 1886s. The 1886s, as you see here as well as I have my two, they're determined weapons, basically. They don't exist for really anything of their burst and their sustain. They exist for this total damage, their base damage, basically. And they have the niche for themselves, basically, because there's no other weapon that has that high of a base damage. The ACRSSs is definitely what I would say are one of the S tiers in this category. I always liked the ACRSSs. Now with the buffs to them, they have really moved up together with all of the other weapons around them. To me, it is enough of an increase that it is worth going for the 7 clicks per second. That is the one thing that really hurts this. If you can get that down, or if you maybe do some macroing or such, this would be my top pick for the faster firing rifles. It being a 30 round mag, you can go with a stability mag into it, taking 3 crit chance mods on it. And it is usable enough that you can get away with it, basically. Then we have the Artist tool, and as we talked about it, and together with the SIGs, the Artist tool with that perfect talent, Rifleman is definitely a pick you can also have in here. I left it out because it is a stacking. This being 6 stacks, I would have to, have it multiple times in there. For instance, if we really wanted to discuss it in depth, I'll just say that Rifleman is a really good pick, and it's being perfect. Rifleman being on this weapon, it is a mid-tier weapon, but is elevated by its talent. If we then go to the SIGs, actually, just to discuss them right alongside of it, because of course the SIG, the CQB variant is what is the base weapon for the Artist tool. They aren't great. They are at best mid tiers. They don't really have anything really going for them. Their RPM is a little bit lower than the ACRSS, but I feel in this category, if you're going for the 300 RPM, you can also go for the 400 RPM with a little bit more practice. Their damage just doesn't make up for it. If we then move on to the classic M1As, the classic M1As will always have a spot just because they are that slower firing weapon. Because of that, you can there's more than enough time to reacquire the target. You can basically leisurely do it, where, for instance, with the ACRSS, you kind of have to, do it in between shots, recoil compensate 7 times a second as well. Doing that 3 times per second, as well now, is so much more comfortable. I feel the classic M1As will always have a spot because of that, even though they are very low on their damage nowadays. And in comparison to other things, the opportunity cost to me, I would actually pick an upcoming one, but still definitely usable. They haven't been nerfed. They did what they always did, and they were always okay. Let's move on to the lightweight M4 and the LVOEC. I'll basically discuss them together. Their main difference is basically that the LVOEC has 20 RPM more with a little bit less damage, but both of them kind of feel the same. They're kind of a little bit jumpy, perfectly controllable in situations. But I feel if you're going already for this 360 or 380 RPM, going that 1 click more to that 420 with the ACRSS is basically within reach, and the ACRSS outdoes these considerably. Both of them are also the same 30 round mag, so you can go with a stability mod. They're perfectly usable, and maybe if for you feel that 1 click per second does make a difference, using a light M4 isn't a bad choice. The M16 did get a pretty big buff, actually, one of the bigger ones, but it is still annoying to use. This one basically makes it 100 RPMs per second, so you don't actually have to click that often, because you're clicking once, you're firing 3 times, as it is a burst weapon. It only has 2 crit chance mod slots, of course. It can't go flatline as well because it doesn't have actually an underbarrel. It is okay, but there's basically just better choices. And especially that the second and third shot aren't basically when you have clicked and aren't per se in your control, makes it actually a lot harder to recoil compensate for, and it does jump up quite a lot. It has pretty bad stability. Then we have the M1A CQB, and also we'll discuss together with it the SOCOM M1A. So both of these weapons should actually have the same stats. Before TU10, they did, on their base damage as well. As you can see, when I hover over the SOCOM M1A, the number basically goes down, even though they have the same mods and such. They never fixed that, and they still haven't fixed that. Meaning that the SOCOM M1A is definitely one not to pick. They are not significantly different. So if we look at it even from their bars, actually the M1A CQB has better stability, as the game shows there. And that does actually hold true as well when you test them. The M1A CQB actually feels better than this SOCOM M1A with no discernible gain for the SOCOM. It is one of the oddities, one of the remainders of an error from TU10, as we're at TU20. But yeah, the M1A CQB, to discuss that one then, it is a top burster. It always was in the category. It didn't get a buff. It still is the top burster. But it comes at a pretty big loss. It being 5 clicks a second is pretty decent. It being a 15-round mag isn't. You hit the reload a lot, much more so than other weapons, of course, and that costs it. That costs it a lot, especially on its sustain. It's lower bound in its sustain being so much lower than everything else around it. It is basically a highs and lows. You can definitely use it, especially if you just need a few shots out, and that there are situations where one mag is enough for a room, for instance, as well, with a well set up build. But yeah, if you're doing any general content where you're firing continuously, a lot of other weapons will overtake this. For me personally, the next contender is actually that weapon, and that's the military Mark 17 together with the police Mark 17, as I called it SOCOM actually earlier. But the police Mark 17 is actually the better variant as well. Just to have said that, the Mark 17, the military, is the lesser one, but both of them are not big differences. There is just a tiny amount of stability difference between the two. They also feel like that. The police actually pulls up less, but this is, to me, the standout winner of basically project results in the rifles. This being less than 5 clicks a second is manageable, especially out of a accuracy and stability standpoint. Getting it back onto target, 20 rounds is pretty good, and will let you do basically whatever you need. You can also take it to 40 rounds for if you're, for instance, going with strained on it. These are, I would say, to me, the replacement for the classic M1A, but I'm not sure I can actually make anybody that actually chooses to use the classic M1A to convert to these. We'll see. I would definitely do it, and I actually definitely am. I'm converting most of my classic M1As to that I was just using as secondaries on build to Mark 17s. The Resolute just doesn't have enough damage for it to be worth it. It is also a very unstable weapon. It just pulls up way too high. You need to, even though it is 300 RPM, it actually feels much more like a 450 RPM. It feels worse than the ACR-SS basically as a weapon. If you've ever used the Harmony, you will know kind of that feeling. That kind of kills it for me. It is a 30-round mag. You can go with a stability mag. You should. It kind of needs it. But at that point, it is still kind of worse of a shot than most of the other 30-round weapons. So I wouldn't pick this one. As we discussed already, the SOCOM M1A is basically never pick this one. It's not worth it. The UIC really needs a buff. It is surprisingly low. To me, it feels kind of like the Stoner in the LMG category. It does have pretty good accuracy and stability. If this was Division 1, where that was much more needed than in Division 2. I could see it. I can't see it in Division 2. I would basically take an ACR-SS with all accuracy and stability mods, basically nerfing its damage because of that, taking the crit chances on the build extra to pull that up, and it would still be ahead of this UIC with it like being all crit chance modded. And that is kind of, a little bit sad because it is a cool looking weapon. Then we have the MDR. The MDR is pretty decent. It is, again, one of those mid tiers. It is basically in between the SIGs and the lightweight M4 and the LVOC. To me, the accuracy, especially of this, is less than those around it, and especially as well, its stability is about the same, but accuracy especially is a little bit less, making it a little less consistent than the rest around it. So I would actually pick around it in those LVOC or the lightweight M4, or especially the ACR-SS. Because, yeah, this 380 is already pretty high up there. Jumping from this to that 420 of the ACR-SS is not a big jump, I feel. And, yeah, I feel that that one outdoes this, generally. Then we have the other high contender, which is actually the USC, the .45. It is a really decent weapon on its stats for burst and sustain, but it is a lot more jumpy than the ACR-SS. And this being the same RPM, then it makes basically the ACR-SS my pick. It isn't a bad choice, especially if you can get used to it, but overall I would pick the ACR-SS over this. So I would definitely say that the general S tier of this category, especially on the high ends, goes to the ACR-SS, the Mark 17, together with the M1A CQB. It definitely belongs in there just because of how much more burst that it has. Other contenders in here are definitely the classic M1A as well still. And of course the 1886 as just a general use. So we have reached the end of this very long video as we had rifles. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of permutations to them. And especially, of course, with some of the exotics, even we aren't really looking that in depth to them. But hopefully, yeah, you did find this interesting, even though it was this long. For my next video, we're actually going to likely go into a few more shorter videos, as I'm going to bring back a few build overviews. And we'll likely towards the end of this week go into a build showcase, and that will likely be on the foam eclipse. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did and are willing to help out, feel free to do all of the algorithm stuffs down there. Just press all the buttons, all the things till everything breaks. And yeah, as always, have a good night.